This is how Hurricane Ian hit Fort Myers Beach. On September 29th, 2022, when the first media helicopters flew over Estero Island at dawn, the pilots had to double-check their coordinates, because what lay below looked like nothing they had ever seen in their lives. The place where the night before a coastal city had existed, with hotels, restaurants, late-night bars, families living their lives, was now a plain of debris. Twisted metal frames, bare foundations, cars overturned on top of buildings that no longer existed, and over all of it, a silence that those in those helicopters would later describe as the most disturbing sound they had ever heard. Fort Myers Beach had disappeared in less than 3 hours. What you're about to see in this video is a reconstruction supported by artificial intelligence of the final 48 hours of a city that didn't know, or didn't want to believe, that this could happen to it. And what investigators discovered about those final hours is disturbing for a reason no one expected. Most of the people who died that day didn't die from the wind. They died from the water. And the water arrived sooner than anyone had calculated. To understand what was lost on September 28, 2022, you first have to understand what existed. Fort Myers Beach wasn't simply a tourist destination, it was a community. Estero Island, the 7-mile-long barrier island on which Fort Myers Beach sits, has a geography that seems designed for paradise and danger at the same time. To the west, the Gulf of Mexico. To the east, Estero Bay, a protected coastal lagoon. In between, a strip of land that in many places rises no more than 3 to 5 feet above sea level. But for decades, that geographic fragility was invisible to those who lived there, because the island gave them something money can rarely buy: belonging. The permanent residents of Fort Myers Beach, around 6,000 people according to the last available census before the hurricane, were mostly retirees from the northern United States who had come seeking sun and calm. Fishermen who headed out before dawn from the community docks. Families who had lived for generations in the same houses along the water. Hospitality workers who lived on the island because it was cheaper than the mainland and because they simply couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The visible heart of that community had a name of its own: Times Square. Not the one in New York, the one in Fort Myers Beach, a small intersection on the Gulf shoreline where the island's oldest bars converged, where seafood restaurants with decades of history stood, where ice cream stands knew their customers by name, and where the most photographed pier in all of southwest Florida stretched, a 560-meter wooden dock built in 1947, extending over the Gulf like a finger pointing toward the horizon. That pier was the symbol of the city. It appeared on every postcard, every travel photo, every magazine article about the best beaches in Florida. And it had something that made it unique in the memory of those who knew it. It endured. It had survived Hurricane Donna in 1960. It had survived Hurricane Charlie in 2004. It had survived dozens of storms that over the decades came and went, leaving minor damage, a little wind, some water, and the confirmation that Fort Myers Beach was a tough town. That history of resilience was a source of pride, but it was also a trap, because what gave residents their sense of security wasn't real information about the risk. It was the memory of what had happened before. And what was coming this time was something none of them had ever lived through. On the morning of September 26th, 2022, while cafes in Times Square opened as they did every day, and fishermen prepared their gear to head out to the Gulf, in federal government meteorological centers something wasn't quite adding up. A tropical storm called Ian had been spinning in the Caribbean at moderate intensity. But water temperature readings in the Gulf of Mexico showed something unusual for late September. The sea was several degrees above its historical average. The Gulf was, at that moment, a reservoir of energy waiting to be absorbed, and Ian was getting closer. But here, the first problem begins, because Ian wasn't moving in a straight line. The track models that the National Hurricane Center published every 6 hours showed a range of possibilities that Lee County residents found difficult to interpret. In some projections, Ian was aimed at Tampa, in others at southwest Florida. The cone of uncertainty, that visual figure used to communicate the probable zone of impact, covered an enormous stretch of the state's coastline. And when the cone covers too much, the sense of urgency is diluted. On the afternoon of September 26th, Lee County issued a mandatory evacuation order for all properties located in Zone A, the coastal strip at highest risk of flooding. Fort Myers Beach was entirely within that zone. The order existed. The information was available. But there was something else available that afternoon that very few people were reading with the attention it deserved. Technical bulletins from the National Weather Service projecting, with a precision that would become chilling in retrospect, that the storm surge in Fort Myers Beach could reach between 10 and 15 feet above ground level. 15 feet, on an island where much of its surface sits less than 5 feet above sea level. But those technical numbers, expressed in bulletins written in the language of forensic meteorology, did not reach most residents in a format that allowed them to visualize what they meant, because reading a number is one thing, and understanding, in your own body, what 15 feet of water does in a matter of minutes is something else entirely. And it was that distance between the number on paper and the reality that number represented that would prove fatal in the hours that followed. On the night of September 26th, while Ian was still in the Gulf, more than 400 miles away, conversations in the bars of Times Square revolved around a topic the island knew well, the hurricane. And the prevailing conclusion, reconstructed afterward from survivor testimony documented in county reports and published in local media, was the same as always: stay, not out of ignorance, but out of a logic that made sense within the universe of experiences those people had lived. Most of those who stayed had been through previous hurricanes on the island. They remembered the winds, the heavy rain, some minor flooding on the lower streets. They remembered the process of waiting, cleaning up, and returning to normal within a few days. To them, a hurricane was a serious inconvenience, not an existential threat. The mistake, which in hindsight seems obvious but in the moment was nearly invisible, was that they confused wind risk with water risk. A strong wind hurricane destroys roofs, knocks over trees, cuts off electricity. It is devastating, but it gives you time to react. You can hide in an interior room, in a windowless bathroom, in the lowest part of your house. A large-scale storm surge doesn't work that way. A storm surge doesn't warn you. It doesn't rise gradually in a visible way. In low, flat terrain like Estero Island, water can go from a few inches on the street to 12 feet inside homes in a span of time that leaves no room for any decision. That is what the technical bulletins were describing, but that was precisely what residents had never experienced before. September 27th began with a revelation that changed everything for meteorologists, though it would come too late to change the decisions of those who had already made up their minds to stay. Ian was intensifying at a speed that few models had projected. Rapid intensification, technically defined by NOAA as a wind, speed increase of at least 35 miles per hour over a 24-hour period, occurred in Ian in dramatic fashion. In less than 48 hours, it went from a moderate tropical storm to a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. The fuel was the Gulf of Mexico, That unusually warm sea that in September 2022 recorded temperatures several degrees above the historical average. Ian absorbed it like a sponge, and every hour it spent over those waters was another hour of energy accumulation. But there was another factor that Fort Myers Beach residents couldn't see on weather maps: coastal geography. Southwest Florida has an extremely shallow continental shelf. In practical terms, that means when a storm surge pushes water toward shore, there is no depth to dissipate it. The water accumulates, piles up, and is hurled onto land with amplified force. And there's more. The shape of Charlotte Bay and Lee County's shoreline acts as a natural funnel. A surge arriving from the Gulf in the direction Ian was traveling doesn't spread evenly along the coast. It channels toward the most vulnerable points, toward the mouths of estuaries, toward the most exposed barrier islands, toward Estero Island. At noon on September 27th, while some businesses on the island were closing their shutters and those who were going to evacuate were loading their cars on the access road, the National Hurricane Center updated its storm surge projection for Fort Myers Beach. The new estimate was up to 18 feet above ground level in the most vulnerable sectors. 18 feet. That is the height of a two-story building. By then, the bridges connecting the island to the mainland were beginning to back up with evacuation traffic. Those who decided to leave that afternoon spent hours getting across. Those who decided to wait until the next morning found a different situation. On the morning of September 28th, winds from the outer bands of the hurricane were already reaching the island. The bridges, the only escape route on a barrier island, were becoming dangerous to cross. The evacuation window had closed. What remained now was to wait. And what was coming for them was not the wind many of them thought they knew. On September 28, 2022, at 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time, Hurricane Ian made its first landfall on Cayo Costa Island, Florida, as a Category 4 hurricane. Sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, gusts exceeding 170. But the wind in this story is not the main character. The storm surge had begun long before landfall. Hours before the maximum winds reached land, Ian's circulation was already pushing a massive volume of water toward the Lee County coast, like an invisible wall advancing toward shore with every passing minute. At 2 p.m., water began rising in the lowest streets of Fort Myers Beach. At first, it looked like the usual. A little water at the most vulnerable intersections, the familiar image of the minor flooding that accompanied any moderate storm. Some of those who had stayed looked out their windows and confirmed to themselves that they had made the right decision. But the water didn't stop. By 2:30, what had been puddles on the streets was now a river. By 3 o'clock, vehicles parked on the lower streets began to float. And by 3:15, while hurricane winds roared outside with an intensity that made the walls vibrate, water inside single-story homes in some sectors of the island had surpassed 6 feet. 6 feet of water inside a house in less than an hour. The 911 call records from Lee County, later analyzed by investigators and documented in official reports made public in the months that followed, reveals something that would become the most disturbing data point in the entire post-disaster analysis. The distress calls began earlier than authorities had expected. People trapped in their own homes. People who had climbed to the second floor only to find the water following them. People on rooftops calling from their phones while the wind made them nearly inaudible. People reporting having seen their neighbors swept away before they themselves could call for help. And a reality that 911 operators had to communicate with a brutality that no emergency protocol can soften. We cannot reach you right now. Rescue teams were ready. Search and rescue boats existed. Coordination existed between the county, the state, and federal agencies, but they couldn't get onto the island because the bridges were underwater. The artificial intelligence reconstruction you see in this video attempts to show what happened in Fort Myers Beach during those 3 hours. Not to cause unnecessary pain, but because understanding the true scale of what happened is the only path toward preventing something like this from unfolding the same way again. The 560-meter pier that had survived decades of storms gave way sometime between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. There is no exact image of the moment. There are only images of before, postcards of a structure that was the symbol of a city, and of after, the empty sea where the pier had stood, with only a few broken pilings jutting above the water like the remains of a skeleton. Times Square disappeared. The Lani Kai Island Resort, a 4-story hotel that was one of the best known on the island, suffered catastrophic damage. The historic restaurants along the coastal zone, some with more than 40 years of history, were reduced to their foundations or to metal frames deformed by the force of the water and wind. Single-story homes in the lowest sectors of the island were buried under 10, 12, in some cases 15 feet of water. 15 feet. The number that was in the technical bulletins. The number that had been hard to visualize on the morning of the 26th. The number that had become real inside homes where people had decided to stay. At 5 p.m., the eye of the hurricane passed over the area. A sudden, disorienting calm. The sky briefly opened. The wind stopped. And then the backside arrived. The winds from the opposite side of the hurricane just as strong, hitting from a different direction. Over an island that was already flooded, that had already lost most of its most vulnerable structures, that already had people trapped on rooftops and on the upper floors of the few buildings still standing. When the winds finally began to ease in the late afternoon, Fort Myers Beach was unrecognizable. And the worst thing authorities would discover upon arrival was not the physical destruction. It was what the physical destruction concealed. How many people were still trapped, and how many could no longer be rescued. The first search and rescue teams entered Estero Island in the early hours of September 29th, as soon as winds dropped to levels that allowed safe operations. What they found is difficult to describe accurately without lapsing into hyperbole, but the official FEMA documents, Lee County reports, and rescue operation records provide a picture that requires no exaggeration. Approximately 95% of structures in Fort Myers Beach had suffered severe damage or total destruction. In the most vulnerable sectors of the island, the lowest-lying areas facing the Gulf, virtually nothing was left standing. In the first 72 hours after impact, more than 1,000 people were rescued from rooftops, from the upper floors of damaged buildings, from boats stranded in places where boats should never be. Rescued alive. But the figures that authorities would confirm in the days and weeks that followed told the other story. Lee County ultimately confirmed more than 130 deaths directly related to Hurricane Ian. It was the highest hurricane death toll in Florida in decades, and the analysis of causes of death revealed what investigators had been warning in their models. The vast majority of victims did not die from the wind. They died from drowning. The storm surge, that wall of water that arrived sooner than many expected, that rose faster than people could process, that didn't give the time that wind always gives to find shelter, was Ian's silent killer. And then came the revelation that would become the most uncomfortable finding in the entire post-disaster analysis. Investigators from the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service published, in the months following the impact, a post-storm analysis that documented with precision the storm surge height at different points along the coast. In specific sectors of Fort Myers Beach, the water reached between 12 and 18 feet above ground level. It was the largest storm surge recorded on that coast in at least 100 years. And the models had projected it correctly, more than 60 hours in advance. The information existed. The projections were accurate. The evacuation orders had been issued. The technical bulletins described exactly what was going to happen. The problem was not the science. The problem was the distance between the technical data and the human understanding of what that data meant in practice. A bulletin that says storm surge of 15 feet above ground level is accurate, but it is not the same as telling someone, the water is going to enter your house before the hurricane arrives. It is going to rise faster than you can climb onto a chair. And if your house has only one story, there is nowhere for you to go. That is the gap that Ian exposed. And it is the gap that risk communication specialists have been trying to close for years without enough success. The total damages from Hurricane Ian in Florida exceeded $112 billion, making it one of the costliest hurricanes in United States history. In just 3 hours, an entire community had ceased to exist as it was, but the story of Fort Myers Beach didn't end on September 29th. In many ways, what came after was a second storm of a completely different kind. In the immediate days after impact, Fort Myers Beach had no drinking water, no electricity, no functioning sanitation. Weeks turned into months without basic services for the few residents who were trying to remain in the less damaged sectors of the island. And then the second battle began. What to do with what remained? The question of rebuilding Fort Myers Beach divided the community, the state, and coastal urban planning experts in ways that no one had anticipated in all their complexity. There were those who wanted to rebuild exactly as before, not out of denial of what had happened, but out of genuine love for a place that had been the center of their lives. Older people who had spent decades on the island, who had no other place to call home, who couldn't imagine a future for Estero Island that didn't include the coastal life they had known. There were those who wanted to rebuild differently, taller, more resilient structures with construction standards that accounted for what Ian had demonstrated. An island that could exist in the same place but prepared for a world where rapid hurricane intensification is increasingly common. And there were those who argued that certain zones of the island simply should not be rebuilt for residential use. That some areas of Estero Island are, geographically, too vulnerable for it to be responsible to allow people to live in them in an era of increasingly intense storms. None of those three positions won clearly. Reconstruction moved forward slowly, unevenly, and deeply marked by the economic realities of those who had lost their properties. Because there is one aspect of the post-Ian story that affects the entire state of Florida, and has consequences that go far beyond Fort Myers Beach, the insurance crisis. Following Ian's impact, insurance companies began to withdraw en masse from Florida's property market. Some left the state entirely. Others stopped renewing policies in the most vulnerable coastal zones. Premiums for those who managed to maintain coverage skyrocketed to levels many homeowners couldn't afford. Florida, a state whose economy and identity are deeply tied to its coastlines, suddenly faced the question that Ian had made urgent. How much longer can these coastal communities remain livable in terms of both economics and safety? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain, but what is known is that the question can no longer be ignored. Lee County was subjected to formal scrutiny over the decisions made in the hours before impact. The evacuation orders, their timing, the communication of the real storm surge risk, all of it was reviewed. In the months that followed, changes were implemented in evacuation protocols and early warning systems at the state level. Hurricane Ian became the most thoroughly analyzed case study on storm surges in barrier islands in recent United States history. What its data taught the meteorological world is today part of the risk communication protocols reviewed at universities, government agencies, and international disaster management organizations. Today, Fort Myers Beach exists in a state of reconstruction that remains incomplete. Some sectors of the island have come back to life. New buildings, more modern and taller, have replaced part of what was lost. Some of the historic businesses that survived the impact have reopened, though in many cases in temporary locations or in reduced forms. The pier, the symbol of the city, that 560-meter structure that had endured for 75 years, was demolished down to what remained of it and is in the process of being rebuilt, with a projected opening date that has been postponed on multiple occasions. Times Square, that intersection that was the visible heart of the community, is today a space in transition. Some businesses have returned, others will never return. The more than 130 people who died in Lee County because of Ian are not just a number in a report. They are residents, tourists, workers, people who made decisions that made sense within the universe of what they knew and what they had lived through before. And that is perhaps the hardest lesson Ian left us. They didn't die because they were irresponsible. They died because the danger they faced was not the danger they thought they knew. Hurricane Ian changed the conversation about hurricanes in the United States in a way that is hard to reverse. Before Ian, the focus of public communication about hurricanes was almost exclusively on wind category. The Saffir-Simpson scale, which classifies hurricanes from 1 to 5 based on wind speed, was the main parameter that reached the public. After Ian, meteorologists and risk communicators began pushing harder an idea they had been trying to establish for years. Wind category is not the most important measure of a hurricane's danger to human life. Storm surge is the factor that kills the most. 90% of historical hurricane-related deaths in the United States have been caused by water, not wind. Ian demonstrated it once again, with 130 lives, with a city erased in 3 hours, with aerial images that the whole world saw on September 29th, 2022, and that are hard to forget once you have seen them. We live in a world where the oceans are warmer than they were 50 years ago, where rapid intensification of hurricanes, that phenomenon that turns a moderate storm into a Category 4 hurricane in a matter of hours, is becoming more common. Where coastal communities continue to grow on the same barrier islands and shoreline strips that scientific studies identify as the most vulnerable. The question Ian left us is not whether something like this will happen again. The question is whether, when it does, we will have learned to close the gap between the numbers in technical bulletins and the decisions people make in their own lives. If this video taught you anything, it is that information alone is not enough. The next time you hear an evacuation order, no matter how many hurricanes you've survived before, what's coming could be different from everything that came before, and the difference between that hurricane and this one could be measured in feet of water. Fort Myers Beach survived Hurricane Donna. It survived Hurricane Charlie. It survived dozens of storms that came and went. But Hurricane Ian was not like the ones before. And that is the story Fort Myers Beach now carries etched into its foundations, its empty lots, and the memory of those who lived through it. A city that knew hurricanes, that did not know this one.